Welcome to another video by AskMath.com. We are solving a system of equations. So the directions say, solve the system of equations, given y equals 4x plus 7, and the other equation is x equals negative y minus 8. So remember that a system of equations just means that you have two equations or more. And so in this case we have two equations. That's called a system of equations. We're being asked to solve the system, and solving a system means that we want to find the values for x and y, or whatever two variables they are, where if you plug in the value for x and y, that the equation, the equal sign, is true, so that the left side equals the right side. And then if you take those same two values for x and y, they also have to be able to be plugged in for the x and the y in the other equation, and they have to work for that one as well. And if you find a value for x and y that do that for both equations, same value for x and y, that make both equations true, then you have solved the system. The value for x and y are your solution. Remember that if you were to graph these two equations, because they have two variables, such as an x and a y, and there are no exponents, for example, that these will make straight lines on a graph. So anytime that you graph an equation like that, it'll make a straight line. We have two equations, so it'll make another straight line, and oftentimes two straight lines will cross at some point. And the point at which they cross is the x and y coordinate that are the values that we're going to find for x and y. Now, it's not always the case that two straight lines on a graph would cross. It's possible that you have parallel lines, they never cross, or it's possible that you have two lines that are the same, one on top of the other, in which case they cross everywhere. But we're going to see if we can find just one solution and see if the lines that these equations make would cross at just one point. So one way to find the values for x and y is to graph it, but we don't have any graph paper, so it's not the best method in this case. You could go ahead and try, but it might not be quite as easy. Especially if you have decimals or fractions, you probably don't want to graph. We don't have any in this case, but we're still going to use a different method. Another method to find the solution would be combination, but combination works best that when you have the equal signs of both equations lined up, that the expressions would contain the same variable. So in this case we've got a y and an x, it's not the same variable. And so over here, same thing, x and a y, they're not lined up. Now, it's true that you could do a little bit of work to make these so that the variables line up, like you could add y to each side and subtract x from each side. But combination isn't necessarily the easiest method. So we're not going to graph, we're not going to use combination, we're going to use substitution. And the reason that I know substitution is a good method to use in this particular problem is because substitution works best when you have a variable like y all by itself on one side of the equation. Y equals everything else, or x equals everything else. And in this case, that's true for both equations. So it's really your choice which one you want to use for the substitution method. I'm just going to go ahead and use the first equation. So I know that y equals 4x plus 7, this stuff. I'm going to take that stuff, I'm going to plug it into the other equation where y is, and that's substituting this stuff in for y. So rewrite the other equation, x equals, now be really careful here, when you substitute, it's a good idea to use parentheses, and the reason is that the parentheses represent the y, or the variable that you're substituting. Now if you notice, this is a negative y. The y gets the parentheses, not the negative. So this is a negative parentheses. You just write the parentheses instead of the y. It's inside the parentheses is where you put the stuff that you're substituting. So y equals 4x plus 7, we're going to write 4x plus 7 where the y was. So now we have a negative, then parentheses, very important, then inside the parentheses is the 4x plus 7. Now don't forget the rest of the equation, minus 8. Now remember, if you don't see a number, the number is 1. So this is not just a negative sign, this is a negative 1. So I'm going to rewrite this just a little bit bigger so it's easier to see. X equals negative 1 times 4x plus 7 minus 8. There, that's better. Okay, so now I have a special situation here where the equation doesn't have a y in it anymore. And that's great. When you have an equation that doesn't have two variables in it, which just got one type of variable like x's, then that means that you can go ahead and simplify and solve and find out what the value of x is. Now before I can solve, I need to simplify a little bit. I have x's in more than one place. I've got some numbers in more than one place. I need to simplify. And to simplify, you just use the order of operations, PEMDAS, and you do the math that you can do. So for example, there's multiplication here. Simplifying using PEMDAS, remember parentheses come first, but I can't add what's in the parentheses because I don't know what x is, so I can't do that yet. But what I can do is I can do multiplication, and I'm going to distribute the -1, that just means multiply, times each expression inside the parentheses. So a -1, remember the negative goes with the term to its right, multiplied by this positive 4x. If you don't see a sign, it's a positive. And that means that x equals negative times a positive makes a negative, 1 times a 4 makes a 4, times x. And I can't actually finish multiplying times x because I don't know what x is yet. If I knew what it was, I'd go ahead and multiply it. But I don't, so I just leave the x times x. Same thing here, -1 times positive 7. The sign goes with the term to its right. And a negative times a positive makes a negative. And a 1 times a 7 makes a 7. Okay, now don't forget your -8. So we don't need the parentheses anymore. We've distributed. And now we have a little bit better problem, but we still have x's in more than one place and some numbers in more than one place. So we're going to simplify. We've got to get the x's on one side of the equation. To do that, we can undo the -4x by using a positive 4x, and then do the same to the other side, positive 4x of the equal sign. Whatever you do to one side of the equal sign, you have to do to the other to keep that equal sign true and balanced. So -4x and a positive 4x makes a 0. But on this side we have x plus 4x, and remember that's a 1x, and specifically a positive 1x, plus 4x makes positive 5x. On the other side, that's 0, but now combine the -7 and -8, and that makes -15. Now we have x's in one place, numbers in one place. We can now solve. So we've simplified, now we can solve for x. And to do that, we use PEMDAS backwards. When we're solving. So what's happening to x? Is it being subtracted? Nope, it's being multiplied by 5. So it's not being subtracted, it's not being added, it's not being divided, it's being multiplied. We're going to undo that multiplication using the inverse operation, which is division. Both sides get divided by 5, so that 5 divided by 5 makes 1, and a 1x, we just can write x, equals the answer to this problem, which is -15 divided by a positive 5. Negative divided by a positive makes a negative, and 15 divided by 5 makes 3. So we found our value for x. We're not done yet though, because remember, to solve a system of equations means we have to find a value for x and a value for y. So to do that, we can just take the answer that we have here, and what's really nice is that this first equation, y equals 4x plus 7, that was already written so that y was by itself on one side. So now our job, instead of an x, is just to take our solution for x and do the same thing. Parentheses where the x is, take that -3, substitute it, and now just evaluate the right side, and we know what y is. Y equals, and now remember that when you are evaluating, we use PEMDAS forwards. So first we would do anything inside the parentheses. Well, there's nothing happening inside. There's no exponents. There is multiplication 4 times -3. Positive times a negative makes a negative. 4 times 3 makes 12. Okay, keep going down. There's no division. There is addition. It's this plus 7. So we're going to do that. Negative 12 and a positive 7 make a negative 5. So now we have y equals negative 5. So we do have what we think is our answer to the system. The solution is negative 3 and a negative 5. And if we were to graph it, that would be these numbers here of the point where the two lines cross. The great thing about math is that you can actually check your answer to make sure that you're right. So in case we made a mistake, we want to just double check. And to do that, you just substitute these values into the equations. So first one, we've actually already done. 4x plus 7, we already substituted the negative 3 in. So we're going to do the same thing, but we're also going to just write the negative 5 where the y was. So over here, we've got a negative 5 equals 4 times, we're going to plug the negative 3 in. And we've already worked out this side of the equation. We found that it was negative 5, so the equal sign is true. Negative 5 equals the answer to this, which we already found is negative 5. So our values worked in the first equation. Now test the other equation, because remember, for a system, it has to work for both equations. Again, be careful when you plug in or substitute. So negative 3 in for x equals, and here's where you got to be especially careful, that's a negative parentheses where the y was, and then you take the negative 5 and put that inside the parentheses. So now we've got negative 3 equals the answer to this, which we haven't worked out yet. And remember that this is not subtraction, this is multiplication, and because we've got this invisible 1 times. Right? So whenever there's not a number, it's a 1. And so it's a negative 1 times a negative 5, and a negative times a negative makes a positive, and a 1 times a 5 makes a 5. Now 5 minus 8 makes negative 3. So because we know that negative 5 equals the answer to this, which was negative 5, and negative 3 equals negative 3, those are both true statements. We know that our solution, negative 3 and negative 5, is the correct solution, and we have the right answer. All right, thank you very much for watching. Make sure to check out the other videos at askmath.com.